ideas that you generate and give me for our classes. However, on this particular occasion, I had several really good ideas offered to me, and I had to make a decision, because at some point the ladies in the office need to be able to get those nice directories that are in the hall that tell you who's doing what in what classroom, and the bulletins and all of those things together, and they need to know this stuff in advance. So I had to make a call, and what I ended up deciding was something that had been sort of incubating in my mind for some time, and that is the book of Micah. And so several of you offered me I very much like. I just wasn't ready to teach them yet because they need a little more time to percolate and develop before they're ready to be taught. But don't despair if I'm not teaching something right now that you had suggested. I'm very likely going to come back around to it. But at any rate, Micah this year in my Bible reading, for whatever reason, just crawled off the page and into my head. I mean, you know how you do that? Sometimes you'll read something that you've read time and time again, but this time around, it just hits you right between the eyes. And Micah did that for me this year, and I thought, I need to share that with you. And I think that this will be a really rich study as we get into the prophet Micah. Now, we're going to introduce the book tonight, and then as you will notice on the syllabus, I've given you a tentative schedule. The emphasis is on the word tentative because A, you know me, and I don't always finish what I hope to finish in a class period, and B, things happen, and weather and other things intervene from time to time and throw our schedule off. So this is a tentative schedule. We'll try to stay close to it, but the dates may end up wandering, especially if we have, as we tend to do in the wintertime, perhaps a Wednesday night or two where we're not able to make it to class. At any rate, I wanted you to notice a couple of things on the syllabus, and one of those is on the very back page at the bottom. There's a section entitled Memory Verses. This is not mandatory, and I'm not going to check if you do it or not, but we have discussed in our classes together in the past the value of committing Scripture to memory. And one of the things that I find about Micah is that it's one of the most memorably worded of the Old Testament books. And there are a number of passages that just really stick in your head. And I thought this is a prime candidate if you're thinking about getting into memorizing some Scripture or getting back into memorizing Scripture, for you to be able to do that along with me and your classmates if you'd like. And so I've given you a list of suggestions, one verse for each week of the class that I intend to cover. And the verse will come from the text for that night, with the exception of tonight's verse, of course, because we're introducing the book. But tonight's verse is from Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, and that will be sort of a theme for our class as a whole. But I'm going to encourage you to take an opportunity and see if you can learn these verses one a week as we go through, and I think that will enrich your study. Let's talk just a little bit about the prophet Micah, because I think once we begin to see where he fits in history, we'll begin to see just how vitally important he is to the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's talk a moment about where Micah fits in the history of the Old Testament in terms of orienting ourselves in time. All right? So if we start back around 1020 BCE, give or take, that's going to be essentially the starting point of what we call the United Kingdom, the coronation of Saul as the first king of Israel. And as you will recall, there are three kings of the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon, each of whom reigned 40 years. However, their reigns overlap a little bit. And so while each of them reigned 40 years, those are not 40 consecutive years apiece for a total of 120. It actually equals out to just a little shy of 100 years because of the overlap. But at any rate, you have that period of United Kingdom, and then about 930, give or take, Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam comes to the throne. And you may recall the story of how the kingdom divides early in the reign of Rehoboam because he chose to try and assert his power instead of listening to the people. And so the kingdom divides. Roughly 10 of the tribes break away into a confederation that typically retains the name Israel, and the two remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin, to the south retain the name Judah. Now, I say roughly 10 tribes because as it works out, it really doesn't end up being all 10 tribes. For one thing, the tribe of Simeon, if you notice where the land grants were located, the tribe of Simeon's land is located pretty close to square in the middle of the tribe of Judah's land. And so they're surrounded by Judah, and by and large, the Simeonites more or less seem to have assimilated into the Jews, the Judeans, and didn't really break away as a tribe and go north. Secondly, when Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who was the first king of the northern kingdom, instituted the worship of golden calves, a part of his worship was to throw out the Levitical priesthood and make priests of what amounted to the dregs of the nation, and to change the feast days and all those sorts of things. And that resulted in the vast majority of the Levites returning south to Judah so that they could continue to worship in the temple according to the law of Moses instead of being subjected to Jeroboam's idolatry. And so you wind up really functionally speaking with about 4 tribes in the south, plus members of the other tribes that migrated south because of the apostasy of the north and other pressures. And then you have the remainder to the north. Now, that lasts for a period of just a little over 200 years. And it's in that 200 years that we find Micah beginning his prophecy. But before Micah begins, around 745 BCE or so, a man by the name of Tiglath-Pileser III, that's a mouthful for an Alabama boy, I told you it was a mouthful. Tiglath-Pileser comes to the Assyrian throne and begins to assert power all around. And as he begins to do that, he begins to assert power in Palestine. And that becomes a looming threat and a recurring theme of a number of the prophets that we have in the Old Testament. Hosea prophesies around this time in the northern nation of Israel. Amos prophesies just a little bit before Micah begins, about 10 years or so between Amos and Micah. He also directs most of his prophecy to the northern nation of Israel. And then you have Micah coming on the scene about 740, and he directs his prophecy both to Jerusalem and to the northern nation of Israel, except right about in the middle of Micah's prophecy, Israel is taken into Assyrian captivity. The city of Samaria falls to an Assyrian siege, and the people of Israel are deported. And the Assyrians do something that the later Babylonians did not do. When they deport their prisoners of war, rather than allowing them to resettle in a new place as a group, they scatter them throughout their empire. And if you think about the logic of that, if you are the Assyrians, that makes a great deal of sense, because by scattering them, you've just dissipated their ability to come together as a cohesive unit of people. Now they're almost forced to assimilate into this sort of cosmopolitan group of people, mixture of people that the Assyrians have conquered from all over the place and scattered throughout their empire. And they are almost forced to assume the identity of Assyrian subjects instead of retaining the identity of their old nationality. And so what effectively happens is the tribes of Israel are lost as tribes. They lose their identity as Israelites. And they don't come back from that captivity. That's just the end of the nation. That's the end of those people, by and large. Okay? So that happens right in the middle of the prophecy of Micah. And you might expect that that would have had a really severe warning impact on the southern nation of Judah, because Judah is just as much subject to the threat of Assyrian reign as Samaria was. But they don't learn the lesson. They hang on a little bit longer, and Assyria continues to threaten them. It ends up not being Assyria that will judge them, but Babylon. But at any rate, they don't really learn the lesson. And so a lot of what Micah has to say is directed to Judah and in particular to Jerusalem, because they're failing to learn the lessons that led to the destruction of the northern nation. And Micah can see judgment coming. And that's exactly what he's warning them about. So we see Micah then prophesying with his prophecy cut almost in half by the fall of Samaria in 722. And he overlaps Isaiah. That's important, because we're going to see, and I think you'll notice as we read Micah, there are some passages where Micah and Isaiah sound an awful lot alike. There's at least one passage where they sound exactly alike. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But their mutual prophecies are very interesting. All right, let's think about who Micah was and where he was from. Micah's home city is located in Moresheth Gath. Micah mentions that in Micah chapter 1, verse 1. Jeremiah also mentions Micah and places him in Moresheth Gath. I believe that's in Jeremiah chapter 26. Moresheth Gath, if you can see on the map, is located sort of to the southwest of Jerusalem. If you can't see the map on the slides, look at this one. And you'll notice, generally speaking, that Jerusalem is roughly on a level with the northern end of the Dead Sea. It's up in the mountains. So this mountain here would probably be the Mount of Olives, and then just to the west of it, the next mountain peak over is going to be Mount Zion, which is going to be where the city of Jerusalem is located. Okay? So if you have Jerusalem here, Moresheth Gath is going to be southwest of it, in the foothills of Judea, somewhere about where my finger is. And so he's going to be someone who is from the foothills, which is a rural area, an area where sheep are very often kept, and also crop agriculture is taking place. It's not very far, by the way, as the crow flies, from the city of Tekoa, which was the home of Amos. And there are some serious similarities between Micah and Amos. Micah, you might say, sort of stands in the middle between someone like Amos, who was very rural, very plain-spoken and straightforward, and someone like Isaiah, who was quite cosmopolitan, but very eloquent and polished. Micah's kind of somewhere in the middle between the two, but he has the rural background that someone like Amos would have. So we locate him over in this area. Now, the name Moresheth Gath is an interesting one. Does Gath sound familiar to anyone? What do you think of when you hear Gath? Goliath of, right? Goliath of Gath. From the story in 1 Samuel 17 where David encounters Goliath of Gath. There's a reason for that. Moresheth, as best we can tell, has some meaning along the lines of the inheritance of. The inheritance of Gath. Okay? Now, what might that refer to? Well, we can't say for certain, but it's probably a decent educated guess that it has something to do with the idea that, remember, David conquered Gath during his reign. Gath was one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. The Philistines lived primarily in the coastal area on the southwestern coast of Palestine along the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, they were seagoing people. But they had 5 principal cities, and Gath was one of those 5 principal cities. And during his reign, David conquered the city of Gath, and he gave it as an inheritance to a certain portion of the tribe of Judah. And it may very well be that what Micah is saying when he says he comes from Moresheth Gath is that he comes from the region of, or the vicinity of, Gath. That is, that area that was inherited by way of David from the Philistines. Okay, so he's from Moresheth Gath, which is this rural area. Now, who is Micah, and what does this name mean? Micah is a name that is a shortened form of the longer name Micaiah, or Micaiah, which means who is like Yahweh. You'll notice here in the lengthened form of it, The last three letters, as we have it transliterated in English, are Yah, right? Which is the first syllable of Yahweh. It's a shortened version of Yahweh. Of course, Yahweh is the Hebrew name for God, which reflects His personality, His covenant-keeping aspect. Okay, it's used as a proper name instead of a description or a title. Okay, this name is essentially the same name as the prophet Micah that we read about in the books of the Kings. It's not the same person, but it's essentially the same name. Micah, Micaiah, one is the longer version of the same name. It's related etymologically to the name Michael. We meet a handful of Michaels in the Old Testament. The first one that comes to my mind is the daughter of Solomon, who was given to David as a wife, as David's first wife. The second one, and one that probably comes to more people's minds, is Michael the archangel, right? The first part of Michael is the same as Micah. The last part, E-L, does anybody know what that means? You can say it out loud. God, yeah, that's the Hebrew word for God. And it can be God proper, or it can be little g gods. Okay, it's just a general word for God. So oftentimes when the Scriptures refer to idols and call them gods, it's the same word. El or Elohim is the plural. Okay, or when it's talking about God Himself, sometimes this term is used as well. El or Elohim. As a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 1, when Moses says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the word there is Elohim, the plural of God. Okay, so Michael and Micah both mean who is like. One is Yahweh, the other is God. Who is like God or who is like Yahweh. Okay, same essential idea, just a little bit different expression of it. Okay, so here's this man who is from rural roots in the foothills of Judea, where the sheep are kept and the crops are grown, and his name means who is like Yahweh, and he's coming to primarily the city of Jerusalem, although also to the nation of Israel, and he's prophesying. Now, let's take a moment and look a little bit more closely at the historical background that leads into his prophecy. He's prophesying against the backdrop of the Assyrian expansion. Now, if you notice on the map that's on the screen, you have this sort of triangular shape in red that indicates sort of where Assyria began when it first begins to rise to power as a world empire. And then you see this area in orange, which is where it began to conquer. Okay? Anybody want to venture a guess why they didn't conquer this big area in the middle? Desert. It's desert, that's right. That's the Arabian desert. There's nothing to conquer, sand. That's about it. And you really can't do anything with it. You can't grow crops there because there's not enough water. You can't raise livestock there for the same reason. It's just desert. And so they didn't mess with that. But what they did do was conquer essentially the whole Fertile Crescent and even down into Egypt. Okay? So for the first time in the history of the world in this area, you have a national power that begins to extend its influence by way of conquest over such a vast area. Now, it's not the last time, but it is the first time. Now, not only did they extend their influence by way of conquest, but the Assyrians were reputed to be extremely brutal. And their brutality, I think, in many ways, was a form of what we would today call psychological warfare. Because they would march into a place and do heinous, horrible things to the inhabitants thereof, knowing that the word would get out. And people would hear about just wholesale slaughters or horrible torture and execution and reprehensible acts that they performed upon the most vulnerable of society, things that would just shock the conscience. And those things would get noised abroad. And when you hear that this is the sort of thing that the Assyrians do when they conquer you, and you look up and you see their armies advancing toward you, what effect is that going to have? It's going to absolutely steal any morale that you might have to stand up and fight against them, isn't it? It's going to be very hard to rally against an army like that has the reputation of doing horrible things to the women and children and the elderly, instead of just merely defeating the fighting men on the field of battle. No, they come in and decimate and destroy and conquer and subjugate and do all of these things. And so Assyria was very much a feared group of people. And they're marching down into Palestine, and they're laying their blanket of control over everything in their path. And so the cities begin to fall like dominoes. You see Damascus, the capital of Syria, falling. And then the next thing you know, Samaria is under the sway of the Assyrians. Jerusalem falls under the sway of the Assyrians. And then they even had the audacity to go down and attack and conquer for a brief time Egypt, of all things. And so you can imagine the psychological effect on the people that they conquered. And that's part and parcel of everything that Micah is prophesying about. Okay? So you can almost hear the boots on the ground marching through the land. And at points during Micah's prophecy, they are literally boots on the ground surrounding the city of Jerusalem. Okay? So you have this Assyrian shadow, and right in the midst of Micah's prophecy, as we said a moment ago, the city of Samaria falls. Now let me pause and talk about that for just a moment. Look again at the terrain. One of the reasons I love this map is because it gives us the terrain. You know, you can't get this looking at a flat paper map. But when you begin to see the elevations and the mountains, and you look, and Samaria is going to be located in this area up here. And look how mountainous this area is. Now these mountains are not, they're not like our Smoky Mountains in East Tennessee that are by and large fairly smooth. These are craggy, rugged mountains, and they're riddled with caves and holes and washes and gullies and canyons and all sorts of things like that, okay? No one had ever successfully even given serious thought to trying to lay siege around Samaria, because it's located up in these mountains and surrounded by all of these caves and places you could hide and canyons that you could use to sneak things in and out. And you know, the whole purpose of a siege, of course, is to cut off the city from its supply line so nobody can get in and nobody can get out. You starve out the inhabitants, and when they run out of supplies and the waste begins to cause horrible diseases within the city because they can't get out to get rid of their waste, you weaken them from the outside in, and typically they give up, right? Well, that's going to be really hard to do in a place where there are all kinds of ways in and out and all kinds of caves and things like that. But Assyria pulls it off. They have the numbers. They have the supply train. They have the soldiers to be able to effectively cut Samaria off and hold them at siege long enough for them to finally surrender, and they take the capital city and they take the people and they march them out of the land and back into Assyria. And not only do they do that, but as I said before, they scatter them throughout the land. Now, I understand that these people couldn't pull up, their newsreader on their cell phones and see the day's news. Nor did they have 24/7 cable news networks that were telling them what was going on. But I can guarantee you that word made it back to Palestine about what happened to the people of Israel who were deported into Assyria, and how that they weren't allowed to stay together in their families and clans and things like that. And here's how I'm almost positive that would have made the word back, made its way back. A couple of reasons. One, the orientation of the Jewish people to family and clan was so fundamental to who they were, to their identity, to the way their day-to-day lives functioned, that if you lost your family, you were considered to be in social limbo, and essentially you were destitute. You want a concrete example of that? Look at Naomi and Ruth in the book of Ruth. That's exactly what happens to them. When Naomi's husband dies and then subsequently her two sons die, here you have two widowed women who have no husband, who have no sons, who have no one to lead the father's house, as the term went, the home where they lived, and they're destitute. And the only hope that they have is for a near kinsman to redeem under levirate law Ruth, because Naomi's too old to bear children, and essentially adopt them back into a family. Otherwise, they're destitute. It's the same idea, by the way, that Jesus encounters. Remember when he comes to the city of Nain and he meets a widow whose son has died, and they're literally in the middle of a funeral procession. And this widow is grieving, and of course she's grieving because she's bereaved of her son. That's natural and understandable. But there's a layer there that you and I probably wouldn't pick up on with our cultural background, and that is, without a son, she's already a widow. This woman has nothing to look forward to but utter destitution. And so when Jesus raises her son from the dead, he not only gives her back her child, which of course is huge emotionally, but he gives her back her own life as well. So to take the people and separate them from family and clan and scatter them throughout the empire is to rob them of everything that makes them who they are. And the second reason that I mentioned is because if you notice that sort of crescent shape, Jerusalem is located right on the middle of a highway that spans that fertile crescent. And that highway is primarily used by traders who are going back and forth from Egypt over to Babylon in the east, and they're carrying goods back and forth, and they're stopping along the way, and they're buying and selling and trading, and sometimes they stop in Phoenicia and put those goods on ships that sail them across the Mediterranean. Sometimes they receive them and carry them down to Egypt, but there's all this trade going back and forth, and the trade route served as the news highway of the day. That's how news traveled, was by word of mouth from the traders who were coming from these places. And so surely these people would have heard, this is what the Assyrians are doing, and it would have struck fear in the hearts of, or should have. And that's kind of Micah's point. All right? Let's talk quickly about Micah's message. The gist of Micah's message is that he is demanding what we're going to call covenant faithfulness. Covenant faithfulness. You really cannot divorce anything in the Old Testament, at least not beginning with Abraham, from the concept of covenant. I would argue all the way back to Adam, but certainly beginning with Abraham, the concept of a covenant between God and His people. That comes in with double force when Moses comes on the scene and gives the law of Moses, because the law of Moses is forthrightly worded as a covenant between God and the people of Israel. And when they violate that covenant, then they set themselves up for judgment. The closest thing we have to a covenant, the way they think of it, is probably a contract. And a contract is kind of a pale imitation. Covenant meant so much more to them, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. But let me just say that at the outset, that covenant faithfulness is what Micah is saying is really the standard of integrity that he's telling people they need to live up to. Okay? What he finds is the strong devouring the weak, which is directly contrary to a number of passages in the covenant of Moses, where the strong are specifically enjoined to protect the weak. And specific careful measures are given so that you, for example, don't harvest the corners and borders of your fields so that they can be left for the poor to glean. And if you drop a sheaf as you're harvesting, you don't go back and get it. You leave it for the poor. And you make special provisions when you harvest your vineyard and your olive trees and things of that nature, so that the poor and the destitute and the disadvantaged have an opportunity to be taken care of. And what you don't do is abuse the poor. And that's specifically enjoined a number of times and in a number of very specific ways under the law of Moses. But Micah finds the strong abusing and devouring the weak, and he speaks out against it strongly. He talks about judgment coming. Judgment is the natural result of breaching a covenant. And everyone understood that in the world in which Micah lived. If you breached a covenant, you had set yourself up for judgment. And that's exactly what Micah is going to say. But he doesn't stop there. And this is where I think Micah becomes really beautiful. Micah views restoration on the other side of judgment. The opportunity to be redeemed after sin, after breaching the covenant, after having to patiently endure the judgment that comes as a consequence of violating the covenant. There's a hope for restoration, both immediately and in the future. All right? Let's take a quick look at the book. The book really nicely divides itself into three major movements or sections. The first one is found in chapters 1 through 3, and it is an announcement of the coming judgment. It's an announcement directed at Israel and at Jerusalem for the breaches of covenant that they've committed and the judgment that's coming. And you're going to see how he develops this, and it's really beautiful and interesting. In chapters 4 and 5, however, he turns his attention to the idea that restoration is promised. Now, the restoration that Micah promises echoes all the way through Scripture. Jeremiah leans on it. Matthew explicitly quotes it. It reverberates through the Gospels, and really it becomes the picture of Jesus that Jesus himself paints in John chapter 10. Does anybody remember the picture that Jesus paints of himself in John 10? He's the what? Do you remember? What is it? The Good Shepherd, right? And Micah in chapter 4 is going to talk about the Shepherd King who is coming from Bethlehem Ephrathah. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But restoration is promised, and the Messiah is a part of that picture. And then in chapter 6 and 7, you have a really interesting genre of Old Testament literature where he sets out what we call a covenant case. This is almost a courtroom proceeding where God is the prosecutor and he's making his case against the nation for their breach of covenant and justifying the judgment that's coming on them. But he doesn't leave it there. He returns again to the idea of hope and restoration. So as we see this unfold, I think you'll enjoy it a great deal. Let's talk for a moment about Micah's place in the canon of the Old Testament. And Micah really has one of the strongest positions of any of the books of the Old Testament. One of the reasons he has an extremely strong place is because Micah is forthrightly and explicitly quoted by Jeremiah. Now, remember on the timeline when Micah is prophesying, 740 roughly to 700? Does anybody recall the time frame in which Jeremiah is prophesying? Yeah. The 600s into the late 500s, or the early 500s. BCE works backwards, right? But he's prophesying right up to and beyond the destruction of Jerusalem that begins in 605 and makes its way all the way down to 586 when the temple is finally destroyed. The city of Jerusalem is sacked and the final deportation takes place. Okay, so Jeremiah spans that whole period, but what's important is Jeremiah is prophesying just about 100 years after Micah, within a generation or two, and he explicitly quotes him and names him as Micah of Moresheth Gath. What does that tell us? That tells us that the Old Testament Jews almost immediately accepted Micah as a prophet of God and that he has a place in the canon. There's really no legitimate argument against his place among the 12 what we call minor prophets, the shorter prophets of the Old Testament. He's cited in the Gospels. Incidentally, the citation in the Gospels, of course, points to the city of Bethlehem. And I look forward to unpacking the significance of Bethlehem with you. But it points to the city of Bethlehem, and it uses Micah's prophecy as the ground for Bethlehem. So He's accepted in the immediate Old Testament. He's accepted in the New Testament, and he's really never been that seriously questioned. And so even though we have some books in the Bible where scholars have tried to make out a case against inclusion in the canon, Micah really stands up to every test, and it's very powerful. All right? So as we move through this book, let me encourage you to think this way, and I know our time's almost gone. Micah does not lend itself to reading with a linear point of view. In other words, it's not like a newspaper article that starts with date and time and tells you the sequence of events. Micah moves back and forth, back and forth, back and forth across this theme of breach of covenant, judgment coming, restoration, breach of covenant, judgment coming, restoration. And what he's doing each time is he's developing the theme. So don't read it expecting a narrative story. Instead, read it understanding this is a man who over and over again is trying to bring back God's people from the brink of destruction. Okay? We'll look into that more next time. I hope this class will be as enjoyable to you as I'm already enjoying it. Thank you so much for your attention.